So what really happens when a U.S. president is on their way out of the White House? Today, we're going to explore the powers, the history, and yeah, the hidden dangers of a president's final days in office. It's a period that puts unchecked power right up against the will of the voters. Let's dive in. Okay, so it all boils down to this one simple but really important principle that governs every single American presidential transition. No matter who won the election, the country only has one president at a time. The person in office, they keep their full authority right up until the very moment their successor takes the oath.
Right, and that leads to a huge high-stakes question. If a president who just lost an election is still fully in charge, what guardrails are even there to stop them from making some really destructive, last-minute decisions that go against the very voters who just decided to replace them?
And the answer? Well, according to legal analysis from the Georgetown Law Journal, it's pretty stark. And honestly, kind of surprising. When it comes to explicit, written-down limits on a lame duck president's power, constitutionally, there are none. The whole system is basically running on unwritten rules and just hoping everyone follows tradition.
All right, so let's just make sure we're all on the same page with this term. A lame duck is any official, in this case we're talking about the president, who is serving out the final period of their term after their successor has already been elected. They're on their way out the door, but they're not quite out yet.
Now, here's the thing. This isn't some new 21st century political puzzle. Oh no. The dilemma of the lame duck has a long and pretty contentious history in the U.S. It actually stretches all the way back to the very first time power was handed from one rival party to another.
I mean, just look at this timeline. Way back in 1801, John Adams used his final weeks to appoint his rival's biggest nemesis, John Marshall, as Chief Justice, a move that literally shaped American law for decades. Then you fast forward to 1933, you've got a bitter Herbert Hoover just refusing to act as the nation's banks collapsed, basically leaving the entire mess for FDR to clean up. And more recently, in 2001, Bill Clinton issued a whole bunch of controversial pardons and last-minute regulations. This has been a flashpoint for centuries.
And believe me, these actions can have absolutely massive consequences. George H.W. Bush sent thousands of troops to Somalia after he had already lost the election to Bill Clinton. Administrations from both parties, by the way, have pushed through waves of what they call midnight regulations. Huge policy changes just rushed into effect in their final hours. And President Clinton's pardon of the fugitive financier Mark Rich, it was so controversial, it even sparked a criminal investigation.
So, okay, if there are no hard and fast rules, what's to stop things from just going completely off the rails? Well, the Constitution does offer some guiding principles, some intended checks on power, even if, they're not always super effective. Let's take a look.
There are a few key ideas here. First, you've got the Take Care Clause, which says the president has to make sure laws are faithfully executed. That kind of implies a duty to keep the government running smoothly for the next person. Then there's the Oath Clause, which binds the president to the Constitution itself, not just their own personal agenda. And the 20th Amendment, passed back in 1933, actually shortened the lame duck period from March down to January, specifically to reduce the power of officials who had just been voted out.
Abraham Lincoln put this idea of stewardship just perfectly. Before he was inaugurated, he said a president's duty is to run the government as he got it and transmit it unimpaired to his successor. The idea is you hand over the keys in good condition, right? Okay, but what about the ultimate weapon, right? Impeachment. Well, here's the problem. It's just not a practical tool in this situation. The whole impeachment process is incredibly slow and political. By the time it could ever get off the ground, a lame duck president would likely already be out of office, which makes it pretty much useless as a real-time threat.
So all this vulnerability, it naturally leads a lot of people to what feels like a really simple, obvious solution for dealing with politicians who stick around too long or maybe lose touch with voters: term limits. And the idea has this very powerful common sense appeal.
Yeah, at its core, the argument for term limits is just so simple. Throw the rascals out. If you're worried about politicians becoming entrenched or out of touch or unaccountable, just make it illegal for them to run for re-election after a certain point. Problem solved, right?
So let's really get into the trade-off here, because there's a real promise versus the problem thing going on. On one side, the promise of term limits is obvious. You get new people, fresh ideas, and a check on anyone getting too powerful. But on the other side, well, there's a big problem. You might be forcing out good, effective leaders that voters actually want to keep.
And maybe even worse, you might kill their incentive to do a good job in their final term, since they can't get reelected anyway.
And this right here is where the story takes a really fascinating turn. Because when researchers actually go out and study the effects of term limits where they've been tried, they find a whole series of unexpected and often pretty negative consequences.
Researchers at the University of Chicago came up with this perfect analogy. Ask yourself this: if you had a super successful CEO, would it make any sense for the company to have a mandatory rule to fire them at the end of the year, no matter how well they were doing? That's basically what term limits do to high-performing politicians.
And the data, man, it totally backs this up. The findings are kind of shocking, actually. Studies find that when legislators know their term is up, they become less productive. They sponsor fewer bills, they miss more votes. Get this, states with term-limited governors actually see lower economic growth. And maybe most ironically, term limits don't get rid of power, they just shift it away from the people we elect and into the hands of unelected, unaccountable staffers and lobbyists.
Okay, so if term limits are a bust, then why do incumbents win so often? Is the whole system just rigged? Well, the research suggests it's not really about the perks of the job. One study estimates that a huge 64% of an incumbent's success comes down to something called selection, which basically means they were a good fit for their voters in the first place. Turns out, voters are pretty good at picking candidates they actually like.
All right, so let's zoom out. Where does all of this leave us? We started with this problem of a lame duck president's unchecked power, and we explored this really popular solution that, well, seems to weaken accountability instead of making it stronger. We're kind of caught in this fundamental tension.
So let's be absolutely clear about one thing. The problem we started with, it is 100% real. The lame duck period is a genuine weak spot in the constitutional system. It's built more on trust and tradition than on hard rules, and that leaves the door wide open for potential abuse.
But, and this is the big but, that really popular solution, term limits, it's just not some magic fix. The data shows it can actually weaken government, hurt the economy, and, at the end of the day, take power away from you, the voter, by limiting your choices. It's a solution with its own serious side effects.
It just goes to show you there are no easy answers here, and it leaves us with the ultimate question, one that really gets to the heart of how we design a democracy. How do we build better guardrails against the abuse of power in those final, critical days, without totally undermining the very system of accountability that's supposed to be the ultimate check on power in the first place?